Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM. In this video, we'll be recreating this particle splash using NeXus, TerraformFX, mesh tools, and we'll set up some rendering in Cycles 4D. So let's get started. Here we are in our scene then, and we can see we've got three elements. We've got a TF terrain. Now your terrain doesn't really matter. You can have it any shape you want really, but what we're looking for in this scene is a TF terrain, which means that we get a nice slope downwards throughout that terrain, and this is obviously going to help the gravity take those particles from the top and splash them down to the bottom. So any kind of terrain shape, you can use whatever you want, but you do want to ensure that you have a downward slope in the scene. Then we've got these objects here. Now these are just primitive cylinders. If we open our pent steps null, these are just primitive cylinders with 5 rotation segments, which gives us this nice kind of pentagon cap. And we also have another null, and these are these collider rocks, and these are TerraformFX procedural rock objects. Look, we've got 4 TF rocks here, and to find those you go to INSYDIUM, TerraformFX, and you can bring in TF rock and create these nice procedural rocks. Now, if we have a look at our picture viewer, you can see that we've got a number of different splashes happening in our beauty. Now you can clearly see, look, here are our steps. We have some particles which are static. These kind of sand particles are birthed on our landscape. And then we've got a number of separate splashes actually. Look, there's one orange one here. There's a red splash of particles here. There is a little blue one just poking through, and another orange one at the back, and then there's actually some background ones which are pushed way back. Look, they're out of focus. And these are all simulated individually, separately of themselves. So this orange one, these particles are not interacting with these red ones. These are all separate splashes that we're setting up here. And what we're using to get the particles to splash up are these TF rock objects. These aren't going to be rendered. They're just simulation tools to get our particles to splash up. So let's start thinking about what we need to do to this scene to get it ready for simulations, because at the moment it is not efficient enough. It is too high polygon. It's going to take a long time to simulate. So we're going to make this more efficient. First of all, let's start with terrain. So the TF terrain, we are going to rename this one our render one. So we're not going to use it for simulating, but we'll use it at render time. So we'll call this one TF terrain render. And just so you know the dimensions of that, if we go to the object tab, you can see, look, it's 1400 by 1400 in the X and the Z, and it has 500 segments in the X and the Z as well. That's our render one. So we'll hit Control, hold it, drag and let go to make a copy. And this one, we are going to remesh it using Delaunay triangles, and it's going to make it way lower poly, but still have the same basic shape. So let's go to INSYDIUM, Mesh Tools Remesh. Bring it to the bottom. We'll put our new terrain as part of the remesh, and this will calculate, and now it is created. Let's just make our terrain render invisible. So now we have got our remeshed terrain. We are going to keep everything default in our Mesh Tools Remesh object, apart from the edge length, which we can increase. This will make bigger triangles, so fewer triangles, and we want to increase them to make it as low poly as possible, but still to retain the same undulations. So the bigger you go on the edge length, the more likely it is that you'll start losing that original terrain shape. But something like that is looking good to me. So with our Mesh Tools Remesh selected, we'll hit C to make it editable. And there it's editable. And then all we need to do is just open this up. We'll take out the polygon. That's what we want. Everything else can be deleted, so we'll get rid of that. And the polygon, let's rename this and call this Terrain Sim. Okay. So now we have a low poly sim, but we can go one step further because our camera position, if you remember from the beauty, is something like this. So we only really need this kind of close polygons to be our collision geometry. We don't need all of this outer peripheral stuff. All of this stuff here is unnecessary. So let's get rid of it. We'll go to polygon mode here, click the brush tool, Let's increase the size of that brush tool. There it is. And then all of this outer one, let's just click and hold and drag around all of that. We don't need any of this collision geometry. It's just wasted polygons. So something like that is going to be fine. Let's have as few as possible. Then hit delete. And now we've got rid of all of those. Excellent. So that is much more optimized for our collisions. Okay. One last thing we can do, if we go to our collider rocks and just dolly in a bit, let's go to the object view again. So these are quite high poly as well. And remember, we're not viewing these in the render. It's just a kind of, like a basher to push around our particles. So we could perhaps try and make these lower poly. Let's go to our TF rocks. With all of them selected, we can go to, look, there is a subdivisions setting. If I increase this, it adds another level of subdivisions, which makes them kind of more detailed. But actually, if you see, if I decrease that, the shape doesn't change a huge amount. So let's just put it on 0 subdivisions and make it as light as possible for our scene. Okay, so that's looking pretty optimized. Now we can start thinking about getting our particle simulation sorted. So we're going to go to INSYDIUM, X-Particles System. This has brought in a default emitter, which we'll be using in a moment. But let's get this collision geometry sorted first. So first of all, we're going to put our terrain sim into our utilities folder. I'm going to keep everything in utilities just to keep it organized. And we need this to be a collision object so particles will bounce off it. So let's go to tags, extensions, INSYDIUM tags, XP collider. Here's the collision tag, so now particles will interact with it. We can take off the bounce, leave the friction on 0, leave everything else default. Excellent. So now we want to make collision objects of these rocks and of all of these cylinders. And instead of having to put a tag on every one, what we can do is join them together. So let's go to our utilities folder, and we're going to choose a utility, and we want an XP join. And this first one, let's rename it and call it join steps. We'll get our pent steps null with all of those cylinders in, put it as a child, and we can minimize that. And now we can just duplicate this collision tag from the terrain. Let's hold control, drag it up, let go, and now those steps have got their own collider tag, and this will be applied to all of the cylinders. Let's do the same for our rocks. So utilities, object, bring in an XP join. Let's call this one join rocks, and we'll drag in our collider rocks null, close that down, and with this one again we'll control, drag, let go the collider tag. And with our rocks, we actually want a bit of bounce and a bit of friction on these to help push around those particles when we fire them at them. So let's put the bounce at say 10, friction at say 5, something like that. Okay, so now we have our scene ready and set up to start simulating our particles. So that's what we'll move on to now. So let's take, actually before we get our emitters in, let's just make all of this collision geometry really dark so we can really see the display of those particles. So let's, in our utilities, if we select all of these objects, go to the basic tab of all of them and change the display color from material to custom. And then look, let's just make this black. And now we're going to see, well, look, you can see our default emitter. If we bring it up, it's much more prominent now in the display. Excellent. So by default, we've got this emitter that's come into the scene. And if we hit play, it's firing off these particles into the +Z direction of the emitter. Now we want to have a shot of particles, and we want it to be shot from a volume, not from this square. So let's go to the emitter object tab. We'll change the shape from rectangle to actually, no, we're not going to do object, we'll do box. And then we've just got this box shape for our emitter. Let's adjust the shape of that. We can make it smaller in the Y, bit thinner in the X. Let's make it even smaller in the Y, something like that. And then what we're going to do, let's move it down so we're on the surface. We can see it intersecting, move it across, and we're just going to do our first splash maybe here, somewhere along this lines. So what we want to do is have these particles shoot out in this direction and smash against these rocks. So just so we're not intersecting the landscape, let's just bring it up a little bit. Hit R for rotate, and we'll point it down a bit on this axis here. Let's have a look. Yeah, something like that. And then hit E. Move it down on the Y just so it's above the landscape. Something like that. And now we want to make sure that when the particles are born, they're going to fire out in this direction, which is the -Z of this emitter. So to do that, we go to the emitter object tab and look in the direction. We can change it from face direction to -Z. Okay. Now if we hit play, we've got particles shooting off and bouncing off the rocks. Excellent. But they're continually being born. We want a shot of particles. So let's go to the emission tab. We'll change the emission type from rate to shot. We'll change the shot type to one of the fluid modes. Let's go with hexagonal. And this will pack our particles in an hexagonal grid without them intersecting. And the amount of particles you get in your scene is dictated by the radius, because the smaller the particles are, the more can be packed into the hexagonal grid. So let's put this radius way down to maybe 0.7. Okay, and go forward a frame. There's all our particles. So we can actually see how many particles we've got here. Let's go to the display tab. We can go to the HUD, show HUD, and we have got 16,000 particles in this splash. So for kind of draft purposes for this tutorial, that's going to be enough. For render time, we have a much smaller particle radius to get loads more particles in there. But now we've got this big shot of particles and they blast up like that. We can see them interacting with the floor and the rocks, but they're not, there's no physics making them behave like fluid yet. So that is what we need to get sorted now. So we'll go to our NeXus options. We're going to do this with our NeXus tools, and we are going to choose an NX gravity. We need a gravity in the scene. Now, because we're simulating a kind of almost slow motion splash, we can kind of fake that a bit just by reducing the gravitational strength a lot. So default's 981, very strong gravity. Let's just put it on maybe 60, so a really weak gravitational force. And now we'll go to NeXus and let's bring in our fluid solver, NX Fluids. Now, you're going to get much more detail in your splashes with the SPH solver. I use the SPH solver 99% of the time when using NX Fluids. It's my go-to one. So we're going to go with SPH. Let's put the substeps just on 5 for now for a little greater accuracy. And let's just see what we get with our scene. So this is now on the GPU. So it's going to initialize those on the GPU. And then we're going to get our fluid sim. So here we go. There's our splash. And if we come round, you can see, yeah, look, we're getting this really cool splash happening already. That's pretty cool. Let's just, now we're going to be rendering these, we're going to be instancing geometry actually, and the color is going to be irrelevant, but just so we can see what's happening a bit more clearly in the viewport, let's adjust this color. So we'll go to the emitter, display, particles. We'll change the color mode from single color to gradient parameter. The parameter we're going to map a color gradient to is how fast the particles are moving. So let's change this to speed. And we'll put this on, say, 120. So what this is saying is when particles are moving at 0 centimeters, there will be this blue. When they're moving at 120 centimeters per second, they'll be white, and slower anything else in between. So that's going to be our gradient. Let's hit play. And now you're going to see that, yeah, so we're getting that gradient parameter. That's looking pretty good. I think we could probably get rid of the white. Let's just take that off. This is just personal preference. Right click, distribute knots, maybe put this at 140. All right, hit play. Cool. So now we've got our particles, and I think we could perhaps, we're in square mode, which is a nice fast particle display mode, but I think we could perhaps just reduce this size factor just to make those slightly smaller looking. All right. Okay, so there we have got our first splash coming along. Now, remember, we are not rendering these rocks, we're just using them to create our splash. And so we have got 2 different tools really to art direct how this splash is looking and how it is being shaped. And that is the size and the position of the emitter and the size and the position of the rocks. And we can make adjustments to these to get different splashes. Now, if we want more particles in the scene, you're going to get a very different splash because there's going to be a greater force pushing those particles up. So look, let's just get our emitter, go to the Object tab, and let's just increase its size on the y-axis. So we've put it up by a couple of centimeters, which means we'll have more particles in here. And let's also just make a quick adjustment to our fluid settings. So in our NX fluids, everything's in default. Now we're wanting to simulate a really big splash, but it's not a huge scene. So one thing we can do to fake that larger scale water body is if we adjust some of these liquid settings. If we make it less viscous, less gloopy, this water, it's going to simulate a much larger scale splash. Let's put that viscosity down to 15. But then, just to make sure that the water still kind of holds together and we get a few kind of tendrils, we could increase this surface tension to maybe, let's just try it on 10 for now. Let's hit play. So again, it's going to reinitialize now because we've changed the emitter shape, so it's got more particles that it needs to create. Now it's in the memory, and now we're getting this really cool big splash coming along. That's good. And we're starting to get a few kind of blobs. See, the surface tension is what's bringing them together into these kind of beaded blobs. Now, I think this is actually splashing up a little bit too much at the moment. So let's just damp it down a bit. Let's go to our XP emitter, emission tab, and in our speed, look, our speed's on the default of 150 centimeters, so it's flying in there really fast. Let's slow this down. Let's put it down to maybe just try 100 for now, so they're moving much less quickly, and we're not going to get as big a splash. Yeah, look, that's looking much nicer. And again, we're kind of faking a slow motion effect. So having the initial particle speed be much slower, that's working for us. And you can really see that surface tension giving us these nice kind of gloopy tendrils. So let's just see what difference it makes moving one of the rocks around. And this is how you're going to art direct all of your separate splashes. Each one, you're going to move around these collision objects and move around the emitter until you get a nice shape that you're after. But for example, let's just take some of these rocks. Let's take this one. And we move this. Look, we've created a little bit of a gap here. So let's just see what that very small difference has made. We're getting particles rushing through the gap, look. And we're getting this really nice kind of sheet of particles, which will then start coming together with the surface tension. And yeah, that's given us something very different. So you can see there's a lot of power here in just moving around this collision geometry and positioning stuff to get the kind of splash that you're going for. Now, I don't really want it to be squirting off in this direction because that is kind of towards the camera. So I'm going to close that hole back up again. But then I'm going to take this one, I'm just going to rotate it around a bit and then move it over here. So this is kind of creating a little bit of a gap here. So let's see what difference that makes. And we could even think about rotating our emitter a little, but let's just play it as is. So now we've created a little passageway, and yeah, look, we're getting this really cool tendril splashing out of there. Excellent. So that's looking really nice. So we are able to kind of art direct and adjust these separate emitters to get individual splashes, which we're going to render separately at the end of the scene. So now we have got that first one done. Let's think about getting this cached up, and then we'll move on to maybe doing one more secondary splash. So what we'll do, let's just close up this rock so we can see what we're doing here. We're going to cache this, and let's just go a little bit higher detail for this cache. So we'll go to our XP emitter, emission. Remember, if we want more particles, we just need to reduce the radius so more can fit in the hexagonal grid. Now we're going to reduce this down to say 0.5, which will be a lot more. I mean, this, as you make small reductions, it exponentially increases the amount of particles in the scene, so just be careful. And also a thing to remember is if you have multiple emitters in your scene, if you are using the SBH fluid mode, as we are, every particle in your scene must be set to the same radius value for that fluid simulation to be stable. So that's something to bear in mind. So we've put this on to say 0.5. Excellent. So let's get this cached. So we're going to go to utilities. We're going to pick a utility and we're going to pick an XP cache. I'm going to leave this default. We're caching to external files. I'm just caching to my documents. You save it to somewhere that's relevant for your scene. I'm going to compress the cache on build, which means it takes longer to cache, but the cache size will be much smaller. And that looks good. So I'm going to build cache. So I'll leave this running. I'll hit pause. We'll come back when it's finished and I'll tell you how long it took. Okay, so that was very quick. 35 seconds was all it took. And now we have a cached sim, so we can just scrub through this backwards and forwards. And there is our nice, cool first big splash. Excellent. Right, so let's make one more then. So what we'll do is, let's just close up our utilities. What we're going to do is duplicate our emitter. And this one, we'll just delete that cache tag. We don't need that. And this emitter, let's move this one and make a different shaped emitter. So we'll move it to say here. Let's make this one a little bit narrower. So we'll make it a bit thinner. We'll put it there. We'll lift this one up a bit. So we don't want it intersecting the floor. So let's bring it down, something like that. So we've got quite a big gap in our rocks here, but we can just have a look and see what this might look like. Let's just change the color of this so it's obvious that it's different from the other one. So we'll go to the display. Obviously, because we've copied it, it's inherited the same gradient. So let's just change this knot to an orange color and this knot to a really deep orange color, something like that. Okay, I'll just switch off our cached emitter for now. So this is going to initialize those particles on the GPU, and then we're going to get another load of particles coming out. So here we go. That's a really nice looking splash there, just where we put it. So what I'm going to do is leave that one as is. That's looking great. Okay, so what we will do is, here's a trick actually. Now, because I've switched off this first emitter, if I go to my cache object and build cache, it'll just ignore this one and it'll just cache our new emitter, and it will ignore this first one. So it's not going to kind of recache it, which is great. However, if you've got it selected, if we hit build cache now, it's going to recache both of them at the same time. And actually the fluid is going to interact with each other. If you want your particles to feel a little bit more coherent in their sim, the orange ones will interact with the blue ones because they're both effectively live. However, if I build cache, and instead of hitting overwrite, where it will redo everything, if I hit continue, it will ignore this one, and it won't overwrite this one that's already cached, but it will cache our new orange one. So let's just do that method. We'll hit continue. This will run through. So I'll pause this again, and I'll come back when it's finished. So that one had fewer particles than our first. It only took 18 seconds to cache. And now look, we can switch off all of our NeXus stuff because we have our two cached emitters, and we can scrub through here. And there we've got two really cool splashes. Now you can see here that if we're at our camera position similar to the render, we're just getting these really nice splashes coming over, and it looks excellent. If we came from a different angle, if your shot needed to be something like this, you can see the fact that we've cached them separately causes a bit of a problem because the particles don't interact, they just intersect. This section here, they're just going through each other because they don't care about each other. They're two separate sims. So depending on your shot, your camera position and angle, you may need to sim all of your particles together to get them to interact with each other. But for our purposes, this is working fine. Excellent. So now we've got our two splashes saved to cache. The only thing we need to do now before we look at rendering is to get our particles, our static sand particles, birthed on our landscape. So what we're going to do is we'll be using our terrain render landscape for this. So a couple of things we'll do in preparation. Let's switch off our 2 splash emitters because we don't need those. Let's go to our 3 collider tags and just disable collisions, just so our new emitter aren't going to be bothered about these, because obviously they're going to be static. And we could also make our terrain sim invisible, and let's make visible our terrain render, which is our high quality one. Okay, and we could just make this one black as well, just so we can see the particles well. So let's go to basic and change it to custom display color and put it on black. Okay. So now we have that set up, we can bring in a new emitter. So let's go to our emitters. Let's go to the object tab and we can create a new emitter. Let's call this one emitter sand. Now the emitter sand we want to emit from the landscape object. So let's go to object, let's go to emitter shape object, and then we drag in whatever object we want to emit from here. So let's just move down. Where's our terrain? There you are. Stick it in. We don't want to emit from the polygon center, we want the polygon area. And let's go to the emission tab. We want a shot of particles. Random is fine. We don't want any speed, so let's just kill the speed. All right, and then let's just put, well, we'll put 100,000 for now. 100,000 particles. Let's just put this in simulate mode, which means we get them on frame 0. Let's just come out a bit. And if I hit NA to hide the lines, so there we've got all of these particles birthed on our terrain object. Let's just go to the emitter sand display options and put the lightest display option possible, dots. There we go. So now we've got our dot particles. But we don't need to actually birth all of these outer ones. We only really need it in and around our scene. So let's use a fall off to do that. If we go to the emitter sand object tab, we can go to the fall off, and then let's set the shape. The default's infinite, so everywhere. Let's put sphere. And now look, you can see that they're birthed within this sphere that's around the position of the emitter. So let's move that position into the kind of middle of our kind of area of interest. And let's put the radius up to maybe 300. Yeah, something like that's looking pretty cool. So now we have got these particles, and you can see there's actually a fall off. So the greater concentration of particles is here within the middle of the sphere. And as we get to the outside of the fall off sphere, there's fewer and fewer particles being birthed. So it gives us a nice kind of feathering of that, which is a really cool effect. Now that's nice. Now we're going to need more particles of this. Let's go to the emission tab. We've got 100. Oh no, we've got 1 million, so that's looking pretty good actually. 1 million is perhaps going to be okay. It could be more that is necessary, but let's just leave it at 1 million for now. And what we could do is actually get this cached. Now, here's a cool trick. We don't need to cache all 90 frames of these static particles. There's no need to do that. It's there's no point in having to save that many files. We can just cache 1 frame's worth of these particles and then kind of hold that cache in that position throughout the whole scene. So to do that, it is really easy. Let's just put our timeline down to 1 frame, go to our cache object, and then we can just build cache. And now it's built that cache just for 1 frame. So our emitter sand has 1 frame's worth of cache. But look, if I go to my cache tag and I can override the playback options and put hold, this means that if it runs out of cached frames, i.e. when it gets to frame 2, it'll just hold the last frame that had cache data for the whole scene. So now I can put this back up to 90 and scrub forward, and we have all of those particles in the cache, and we haven't needlessly cached 90 frames of 1 million particles per frame of data that is unnecessary. Let's just go to our emitter sand. We'll go to the display options, and we can, in fact, look, let's go to our object fall off. And what we can do is just put visible off, so we're not looking at that fall off. Excellent. And then in our two emitters for our splashes. Let's go to the display options and just check off draw emitter, so we're not looking at those. We can reactivate them, and now we have got our scene pretty much ready to go, although we may recache these particles so we have more of our sand particles. But now we have got our scene kind of looking how we want it. Everything is in cache. We've got our two splashes coming over our scene. We've got our sand particles. So now the particle bit is ready to go. We can start thinking about sorting out this for rendering. So here we are, I'm in my Cycles 4D layout. So here is our viewport here. We've got our node editor here where we'll adjust our Cycles materials, and here is the real-time preview where we'll see the preview of the render. So you can see that this is obviously the scene where we left it with our cached emitters and our splashes. The only additional thing we have in here, if I just dolly out, you'll see that there are two, this is the only lighting in this, there are two Cycles 4D soft boxes set up here. There is this one and this one. And to get your softboxes, just go to INSYDIUM, Cycles 4D. It's within the light kits, and now you've got the softbox. And you can see those two softbox are in this kind of configuration. And this softbox here is our first one, set to a strength of 20. It's our main light. And the only difference from the default is that there's a bit of warmth in the color there. Look, a little bit of warmth, not just white. And then our softbox, this one, is to give us some kind of rim light highlights. And this one has a strength of 3, and again it has that same nice warm color. But other than that, totally default. And that is going to be our only lighting in this scene, these two softboxes. Okay, so what we want to do first of all is just set up a camera position that's similar to our beauty render. So I'm thinking something along these lines is going to be our camera position. Okay, so let's create a camera. We'll go to INSYDIUM, Cycles 4D camera. Here it is. Let's look through that camera, and then we'll just, so we don't move this camera, let's go to tags, rigging tags, and put a protection on, which means you can't accidentally move it. Okay. So if we start rendering now, we're not actually going to see anything. It's going to be black, even though we've got lights in. And that's because there are no materials on the particles, so Cycles can't see the particles at the moment. And it can't see the geometry because we have made it. Remember in Cinema 4D, we made our geometry black. So there's just nothing to render. There's nothing to reflect any light. So let's create a material for our geometry first. We'll go to our material manager here. We'll click on this arrow and we'll click Cycles 4D, Surface, and we'll bring in a principled, in fact, let's bring in a principled BSDF. This is a very good material. Now this material is really a do-all material. It can do subsurface scattering, it can do diffuse materials, it can do metallic, it can do glass, it can emit light, all from just one node. So if you follow my mouse down to our node editor, here is our node editor. We've got our node here, and here are the attributes. Now actually we don't need to see these attributes here, because when you select a node, you can see the attributes in the normal attributes manager in Cinema 4D. So let's switch this option off, just so we have a bit more kind of real estate to look at our nodes. So let's go to Options, and just uncheck Show Attributes, and now we're just looking at our nodes. So the principled BSDF material is just one node that goes into the surface of our output of our object. And here are the settings for that node. So let's just take that and put it onto our terrain render. And you'll see, if we start rendering, that, yeah, look, now that we've got a material on, our softboxes are starting to render that terrain, and we can see it. Now what we want is, we want this to be completely, virtually completely black actually, because we've got particles that we're going to render on the top. So let's just change the base color and just make it just black. And we're seeing this because if you have a look at our node, we have default specular value of 0.50. So this specular here, this light we're seeing, is the kind of specular reflection of our softbox on the surface of our landscape. So if you reduce that, it reduces the strength, the kind of brightness of that specular. If you were to increase the roughness, it would make it more and more diffuse, which spreads out that specular reflection. So really rough ones, it spreads out that specular, giving it the look of this light, even though the actual material is black. But this is kind of a very diffuse reflection of that softbox. If we reduce the roughness, it makes the reflection sharper and sharper and sharper, and if we switch it off, we get just a completely no diffuse nature to the reflection of that softbox whatsoever. And if we switch off the specular, we have nothing and we're back to square one. So let's leave the landscape one just like that, because it's the particles that we want to actually render. So to render our base particles, these blue ones, first of all, let's go to our XP system. Let's go to our emitters, and it's our emitter sand. Now, if we go to our tags, extensions, INSYDIUM, and put an Cycles 4D instance tag on that emitter, it's going to instance some spherical geometry for every particle, and it's going to give them the particle color. So you can't actually see it, but it's made a load of spheres for every one of those ground particles, and then that is obviously reflecting the light from our softbox. So let's go to our instance tag, and even though these are cached particles, we can reduce the size just by reducing the size of the instance that's being created. So let's make it fewer segments, these instance spheres, because they're small. We don't need to have that much resolution, so there'll be fewer polygons being generated, which is always an advantage. And we can reduce the size down to maybe 70%. And we could go even lower, maybe 50%. And we could do size variation of 60. All right, so we're starting to see these individual spheres now, but they're still too big because these are going to be kind of our little grains of sand. So let's put the size multiplier maybe down to 20. Let's have a look. Yeah, we're kind of getting there. We'll leave it at that for now, but we don't want these to be blue and to adopt the particle color. We actually want to give them their own material, and we want a material that's going to kind of absorb some of that light and spread it out. And quite an efficient material to do that is a Cycles 4D one called, if we go to the Cycles 4D materials, to the surface, we can bring in a translucent shader, this translucent BSDF. So let's put this one on our sand. And now you're going to see this change, because now this is this translucent one. But the thing is with the translucent BSDF, here it is here, look, is that you lose that nice specular that you get, this kind of reflection of our softbox. So what we're going to do is add that in by combining both the translucent node with an ordinary node that gives us that specular. So let's change this color and make it a bit more of a sandy color, something like that. And now, let's just hold 2 to zoom out a bit. We're going to create a new shader. So we're going to create a shader and an add one, which can mix two together. So look, let's, instead of this one going into the surface of our particles, let's put this one into shader 1 and this one into the output. And now we're able to get another node and put it into shader 2, and it'll add them together. So let's right click, shader. We're going to do a principled BSDF. We're going to make the base color black. Pop that into shader 2. And now we're getting a bit of a highlight from our lights, because this shader has this specular strength. We could maybe reduce that roughness down more so it's not quite as diffuse. Remember, we are instancing 1 million particles here every time, so it's a pretty impressive performance. Okay, so that is our sand, and arguably I think they could perhaps be even smaller. Let's go to our instance tag, put the size multiplier on 10. Cool, and seeing a bit more kind of sandy-like definition. So that's that. Now what we want to do, we could actually, let's just switch off that sand emitter. And now for our steps, we want these to be, have a little bit of a kind of reflection, and we can use that. We can actually use a very similar material that we use for our landscape. So let's duplicate this one, hold Control, drag it down, and this one, we'll rename it Principled Steps. And we'll put our principled steps on, where are they? Here's our steps join, so let's put it on there. But on our principled steps, we want to have a bit of that specular, and we want the roughness to spread out that specular over the steps. Yeah, look, can you see it now? Because we've increased the roughness, it's spread the reflection of that light across our steps. And if we want it to be brighter, we can increase the specular brightness. Very cool. And another thing that we could do actually when we're talking about reflecting light is if we added a slight bevel to the edge of these steps, it's going to reflect a bit more of that light via the specular. So look, we could do that easily if we just go into our join steps and go into our null, and if we select all of our cylinders, because these are primitive objects, the procedural, we can go to the caps and we can activate the fillet. And look, it's given us that really nice highlight because we've effectively created a bevel on those caps. So that's really cool. I like that. We'll leave that like that. Very nice. So now if we then reactivate our sand emitter, now we have got our sand with our objects kind of poking out. Now, for the beauty, I would advise, we have 1 million particles at the moment for our sand. I would say that we would want probably maybe 4 times that, 4 million particles with a smaller instance size to really make it feel like these are grains of sand. But for our purposes, we can just leave it as is, that's fine. Now, you can see in this part here that we're still seeing our rocks, and actually we don't want to render our rocks. So let's go to our utilities, and our rocks, let's just make that not editing. So now we're just seeing our steps protruding out from the sand. Very nice. So now we want to render our particles. And we can do that. Look, we want the same kind of translucent with specular material we've got for our base particles. So let's just take this shader, this material here, and duplicate it. But this one, our new one, we can just go into the translucent shader here, click on the color, and let's make this one a nice kind of bright orange, maybe something like that. So that's a much more orange one, and we'll put this on one of our splash particles. Now we also need to put our instance tag on, so we've got control over the size. So let's take our instance tag from our sand, hold Control, copy it on there. Let's just delete that second material that we accidentally copied, something like that. Now this one can be a lot bigger. Look, our particles are way too small for our splash. So let's go into our emission and put this up to maybe 70%. Yep. So now we're getting that. Look, that's looking pretty cool. Let's just do one more. So we'll take this translucent and we'll duplicate it. And then this duplicate, let's make this one a blue one. And that we'll put onto our emitter 1. There we go. And of course we can take our instance tag to copy it on. Excellent. So now we have got our basic setup. What we could do is actually pull a bit of focus here. Let's go to our camera, and in our object tab we'll pick the focus, and we want to be focusing in on our splash, obviously. So let's pick this, maybe this step here. And then we'll go to our Cycles 4D camera tag, and let's add a size to the aperture. Let's put it on maybe 0.05. Yeah, so see, we've really blown out our focus in the front of our frame, and we really want to have this frame nicely with the hero image in a good position. So maybe this part would be a nice part of the frame to be focusing in on. So we can maybe go to our camera and maybe something like that. Excellent. Let's just close that down. We'll add a bit more room. We'll make our size maybe up to 70%. And as we've made that adjustment, we get a larger window. And as this cleans up and cleans up, it will obviously start getting more and more detailed. And there you can see we've got this really nice kind of reflections from our softbox. We've got a bit of shadowing underneath, which obviously is very important for that contrast. But we've got that nice kind of translucency absorbing into our splash particles as well. So that's how we can render just 2 splashes, but obviously for the beauty, there were about 6-7 splashes in there, all layered up with various different emitter positions and various rock positions to give us the splash detail that we want. But this is the effect. You just scale it up for your scene.